Alone, in Deadwind Pass, a pretty empty zone, stands a single tower, crumbling and lifeless. Throughout all of Vanilla WoW, folks can only speculate what the future would hold for that tower. There was even a legendary staff that teleported players to the former home of the Guardian of Tirisfal. But it wouldn't be until the release of the Burning Crusade that the doors to that crumbling structure would be unlocked, and the first level 70 raid would become available. One of the most unique and memorable raids of World of Warcraft was some smart level design, creative boss encounters, and an attunement quest chain you'll never forget. So put on your fanciest clothes as we crash this spectral house party in the hunt for Tier 4 in this one-shot love letter all about Karazhan. A couple thousand years after the Burning Legion first invaded Azeroth, the High Elves of the Eastern Kingdoms created the Council of Tirisfal. The Council would pick a wizard to be their champion, one who they would temporarily pour all their magical energy into, making a super powered up mage, who would then go off and fight demonic threats throughout the world. The second to last champion of the council was Attuiment, and while fighting some demons up in Northrend, she encountered the Avatar of Sargeras, who she managed to defeat and seal away in the Temple of Elune, which would later be known as the Tomb of Sargeras. While the physical vessel of Sargeras was defeated, his spirit lived, and it hid away inside of Attuiment for a time. Attuiment became a guardian of Tirisfal and set off to Deadwind Pass, where she created the Tower of Karazhan to live in, and the tower was built on top of this overlap of magical ley lines. And that led to Karazhan being filled with magical and uncontrollable energies, visions of the past and future, portals to other realities, and arcane anomalies. All of that stuff flittered throughout Karazhan. A couple years later, Attuiment gives birth to her son, Medivh, and Medivh would inherit the title and powers of the Guardian, and he would make the Tower of Karazhan his home. However, the spirit of Sargeras that was inside of Attuiment would transfer down to Medivh, and the new Guardian would become possessed by the Lord of the Burning Legion. Medivh would end up opening up the Dark Portal on Azeroth, which in turn summoned demons and trapped spirits within Kara. Eventually, his apprentice teamed up with his best friend and they broke into Karazhan and they killed him. Since Medivh's death, the Tower of Karazhan had begun losing its magical powers, but the Wizards of Dalaran had started investigating the tower and scavenging any magical items they could from the place. But none that ventured into the home of the former Guardian ever returned. And while returning to investigate some more, Dalaran wizards called the Violet Eye have discovered that the tower has sealed itself shut, with some of their colleagues still trapped inside it. One of the most memorable things about Kara was its attunement process. To get into the raid, you had to complete this big quest chain that gave you the key to the tower. I remembered it being a big, long thing, but honestly, looking back at the quest chain, it seems pretty manageable. You complete a few easy quests for the Violet Eye Mage outside of Karazhan, then you talk to a dude outside of Dalaran's bubble, then you talk to Khadgar and he sends you to 4 endgame dungeons: Shadow Labs, Black Morass, Steam Vault, and Arcatraz. Now you would need to complete the Black Morass dungeon and talk to Medivh to complete that part of the quest, but for the other 3 dungeons you need to find these jars that were hidden inside the instances, which when broken would have a tough elemental enemy inside. You would beat the elemental and get a key piece. Get all 3 pieces of the 3 elementals, get them blessed by Medivh and Black Morass, then go talk to Khadgar, bada bing, bada boom, now you're attuned. I guess also looking back is the amount of work it would take to get into those 4 dungeons. Like, you can't do Black Morass unless you do the Escape to Durnhold instance first, and Arcatraz is the hardest of the 3 Tempest Keep dungeons, which you need a flying mount to get into, and Shadow Labs is the toughest Auchindoun instance, which also required a key to access. So getting attuned for Karazhan wasn't like that easy, since it needed a lot of work to get access to those dungeons, but once you had access, it really wasn't that much additional effort. But the journey was long enough that I can still remember where some of those jars are, even though it's been over 10 years. I think Karazhan is one of the most memorable raids in all of World of Warcraft. There are plenty of raids plunging into ancient temples, sieging cities, and dealing with whatever dragon crap is happening that expansion. But Karazhan is a wizard tower full of spectral partygoers putting on a show that leads into weird arcane and demon shenanigans as you progress further up in the ever-winding and deteriorating sanctum of the former Guardian. The concept of Karazhan is pretty unique in World of Warcraft. You really don't go into that many spooky magical towers. Most of the raids you do are pretty high-key and dramatic, as opposed to Karazhan's kind of more subtle, somber tone. But what I think really makes Karazhan special is the level design. Kara is a wild instance. You start at the front door on the ground floor, and then you have 3 options of where to go next. You can go off to the right and fight through a bunch of animals in the servants' quarters, or go straight through to the stables and fight Attunement the huntsman, or take the stairs right up to the banquet hall and fight Morose. Already you got options, and all 3 paths end up blending into each other later on. Like the stables is connected to the kitchens, which are connected to the banquet hall, or the servants' quarters, which lead up to the guest chambers, which lead down to the banquet hall. Since Morose is the only one of those 3 starting bosses required for progressing through the rest of the raid, you don't have to venture out to the stables or servants' quarters unless you wanted to tackle the extra bosses. After dealing with Morose, you can fight the next optional boss, the Maiden of Virtue, or you can skip her and go right to the Opera event, which is the next required boss. After the Opera event, you start scaling the tower, leaving the spectral party, and diving into the arcane anomalies that envelop the tower. At this section of the raid, it's actually kind of cool. A new entry point is open. You can now enter the raid through the side door on the 4th floor, which is a lot better in my opinion than doing what other raids do, which is just have some NPC teleport you to the last boss you need to fight. The infamous Curator is up next, and this boss was the biggest hurdle for any raid group at the time. The big robot was a DPS check for your raid. If you could beat Curator, you could probably beat the rest of the instance. And with that, the 3rd required boss of Karazhan is defeated. Now we move on to the library section of the Wizard's Tower, and it's this big, massive, spiraling section that, if you look up, shows that it's even more weird and distorted than what it seems. Hidden behind a bookshelf is this path that leads to the demon Illhoof, who's performing ritual sacrifices. Then there's the ghost of Medivh's father trapped inside the tower as well. You can fight the Shade of Oran, who is hidden inside a private library, or you can move on up to the observatory where the Nether Dragon Netherspite resides. So none of these 3 bosses are required and are all in sections that branch away from the main path. The main route leads to the very last required boss encounter, the 4th and final one, the chess event. Once the chess event's completed, only the last boss remains, and that's up through the winding stairs that lead past Medivh's private quarters, and that's where the tower devolves into the nether space where Prince Malchezaar awaits. The layout of Karazhan is huge, with tons of different bosses and routes to take, which could have a group blaze through and only kill a few required bosses to get to the prince, or go off and clear out this whole instance, taking every side challenge. The multiple paths and bosses and how they loop and connect with one another is really cool, but another strong aspect of the raid is all the little details that make it stand out. Like the guest chambers, where you can find the corpses of Romeo and Juliet and their poison and stuff, or how Illhoof has a burned up human corpse in his ritual circle, implying that he had just recently performed a sacrifice, or how the trash mobs before the opera event are all cast and crew dressed in costumes for the upcoming play. It's like the little touches that add a lot of character to Karazhan, and that character, that charm, helps make the raid all the more memorable. The bosses in the raid were pretty unique. Morose has 4 mini bosses with him that all need to be crowd controlled and dealt with in different ways, and those mini bosses come from a pool of 6 that could appear, so they're not the same every time. You get a Shadow Priest, a Holy Paladin, a Ret Paladin, an Arms Warrior, or a Protection Warrior. And you gotta deal with those 4 hooligans in different ways while also dealing with Morose himself. It's a pretty unique and clever boss. Then there's the Opera event, and how Opera works is it has a chance to be one of 3 different events. You'd get out on stage and Barnes would announce either the tale of Romulo and Julianne, the Wizard of Oz, or the Big Bad Wolf. And the last one is a very iconic fight where the wolf would turn a player into Little Red Riding Hood and chase them around the stage. And I remember, you're not allowed to cut corners. You gotta do the whole circle. And the wolf is chasing you the whole time. And if you've ever used Deadly Boss mods before, you're pretty familiar with what the wolf ends up saying.
Run away, little girl. Run away.
The fact that either of these three plays could happen is really unique, and it can be infuriating if you don't get the one you want, since they each have their own separate loot table. But you don't really have an encounter like the opera event in other raids. And then there's the chess event, which also has its own problems. It's fairly easy even back in its day, but you and the raid would take control of chess pieces on a board and try to defeat the enemy and kill their king before they kill yours. Each piece has their own moves and special abilities, and the game isn't really like chess at all, but it's still pretty fun, and it's very unique and it's very different and very, very memorable. These next two bosses I'm going to talk about are kind of cheating, but to me, they're a staple of what makes Karazhan so special. The first one is Nightbane. So the only way to summon this husk of a dragon was, or used to be, you needed to complete a long and busy quest chain that granted you an urn, which you could use to call the boss right near the 4th floor entrance. Nightbane was notorious for being a lot harder than some of the other bosses in Karazhan, as well as being rare since not a lot of folks had the urn to summon him, and Nightbane wasn't required to complete the raid. The other boss was a special event. Right before Wrath of the Lich King was released, a Scourge Invasion event happened where a new boss was added to Karazhan. In a side room above the stables was the Blood Prince Tenris Merkblood. While the boss himself is pretty forgettable, the item he dropped wasn't. Merkblood dropped the Arcanite Ripper, which is a two-handed axe that turned the player into the undead guitarist of Elitar and Chieftain. I really wish I wasn't playing a rogue at the time of that event, because I would have loved to have that axe on my paladin, but you know, what can you do? It was a special item that helped endear so many more to Karazhan. It wasn't just the first raid of the Burning Crusade, it was a really well-made raid, full of unique boss encounters and very solid level design, with tons of added details and bonuses. I want to wrap this video up by telling you all my second favorite video game moment ever. So back in the Burning Crusade days, I did play a Ret Paladin, and one of the guilds I had joined after hitting 60 was this really chill guild called Nymphomatic. I ended up leaving the guild because I wasn't a very committed player, and I was like 12 or something, but a few weeks or sometime later, I see that they're doing a Karazhan run, and they needed a 10th. I hit up the guild leader, whose name I don't remember, but I do remember he was an undead priest, and I tell him, hey, I'd love to join your raid. And the guild leader, he knew that I was like a pretty young teenager at the time, but he brought me along anyways, which was really cool of him, and I got to go on my first full clear of Karazhan. It was really cool to have a real successful raiding experience. I'd done Karazhan a little bit, but we never really got that far. What I remember clearly was after we beat chess, the guild leader asked me if I'd ever done Prince Malchezaar before, and I said I hadn't. And he was like, listen kid, if you get through this whole fight and don't die, I'll give you 100 gold. Which, if you don't know, was a lot of money back in the day, especially to me. And, well, your boy got through the whole fight successfully without dying, and it was the first time I had ever fully cleared a raid. Now, something that I always found real dope about Karazhan was how iconic the weapons that dropped from the instance were. You got Legacy, Despair, Wolf Slayer Sniper Rifle, the King's Defender, Light's Justice, and Sun Fury Bow of the Phoenix. But the most iconic weapon for me that dropped out of Karazhan was the one that dropped off of Prince Malchezaar that night. The guild leader had given me 100 gold, and then Gorehow dropped. And because nobody really wanted it, they just let me have it. I'd been swinging around blues for so long to finally get an epic weapon, and to get it at the end of my first full clear of my first real raiding experience, it meant a whole lot to me. I still keep that Gorehow on me to this day, and it is my go-to transmog weapon. Karazhan has a lot of personal meaning to me. It's my first raid, my first fully completed raid, my first epic weapon, it's where I got my first tier pieces. There's a lot in that instance. But beyond my personal experiences, there's a lot of good level design decisions, boss mechanic decisions, and some bonus details that bring the raid into the upper echelon of top tier World of Warcraft instances. I love this raid. It is my favorite one. And hopefully you get a chance to give it a try, and if you do, you end up enjoying it just as much as I did all those years ago when Karazhan reopens for classic Burning Crusade. Thanks so much for watching, and have a good one, and take it easy.